You're listening to The Conversation Weekly from The Conversation. I've been working at The Conversation for more than a decade now, and some of my favourite stories are the weird and funny science ones. I'm talking about scientists teaching rats to drive cars, or cockatoos to open recycling bins, or even getting a giraffe to make statistical inferences. I think what I like most about these kind of stories is imagining the life of a scientist who actually spends their day doing this work. Like, what kind of person thinks to themselves, I wonder if we could teach a parakeet how to dance, and then spends hours upon hours mapping out step patterns for a bird. Today we have a conversation with one such scientist. Scarlett Howard is a lecturer and research fellow at Monash University in Australia, where she runs the Integrative Cognition, Ecology and Bioinspiration Research Group. And Scarlett spends a lot of her time training bees how to do maths. She recently wrote an article for The Conversation in defence of what she calls ecologically irrelevant scientific experiments. So a bee going about its little bee life doesn't really need to know the difference between even and odd numbers. And yet Scarlett believes that these kind of experiments are actually really important. And today she tells us why. I'm Gemma Ware, and you're listening to The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Hello, Scarlett. Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
It's great to be on. I absolutely love working with The Conversation.
Ah, great. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your work. When did you realise that the experiments you wanted to do were what you've termed ecologically irrelevant ones?
Let me start by saying that I do ecologically relevant work as well. So we work with bees, and so we do a lot of work on pollination and foraging and how they choose flowers. But on the other hand, yes, we do a lot of work that could be termed ecologically irrelevant. And I suppose that was from the beginning when I started working with bees. I first worked on their visual perception and how they perceive visual illusions and size differences. And I suppose that can have some ecologically relevant aspects to it in terms of how they choose flowers. But then from there, I got interested in numerical cognition. And so that means how bees do mathematics, deal with number, process number. And a lot of that work would be probably considered ecologically irrelevant to bees.
And what makes an experiment ecologically irrelevant?
This is such a good question because it's tricky to answer, because I would say that different researchers, scientists, and probably even members of the public would define that differently. So for me, I have defined it as the design and implementation and then looking at the results and interpreting them without any clear ecological relevance. So that is like the life history of the species, its ecology, its natural environment. So without any of those factors sort of playing into the experiment design. So for example, I would consider one of my experiments training bees to categorize odd versus even numbers as probably quite ecologically irrelevant as far as we know. Now, you could always argue that there's a bit of ecological relevance in it. So we are training these bees using sugar water to make correct decisions. And where, they're freely flying, so they're out in the environment, they're choosing to come to our experiment. But when we designed this experiment on odd versus even numbers, we definitely weren't thinking about it in terms of the ecology of bees or, what might be applicable in their environment. That stuff sort of came later.
Can you give us some highlights of ones that you've come across in thinking about this that have really struck you as, pretty out there?
Let's not call them too out there, I suppose. I don't want to make anyone's work, put it into this box of pure ecological irrelevance. So, that's why I also try to include a lot of examples of my own work, which I think is quite ecologically irrelevant, which is, as I've said, the addition and subtraction, the odd versus even. But then there are examples of there was this great study on fish driving cars, so navigating cars. It was little tanks that had wheels on them that the fish could control itself. But I think the concept of a fish driving a car could be considered quite ecologically irrelevant. You have training primates to use Arabic numerals and sum them and do that using computer screens. So those are a couple of my favorite ones. You also have pigeons learning symbolic representation of numbers, sort of like Arabic numerals as well. We've also done that with bees. I think for those sorts of things, there's no really clear pathway to ecological relevance.
And for you, Scarlett, why did you choose to start working with bees?
We were told not to choose our projects when I did my master's degree for the species, but to choose it for the question. And actually was really scared of bees when I started. So I did not choose to work on bees because of that. I chose the topic because it was so interesting to me, which is, can bees learn and how do they learn? And I thought, wait, insects can learn things and they have cognition. What is this about? So I did do it, and then I slowly became less scared of bees and actually really fell in love with them, and then learnt about all the great things they do in terms of pollination and ecosystem services. So that's sort of how it began. And I think that when I got sort of hooked on this work was really just the fact that you can train an individual bee. So we work with individuals for hours and hours at a time, just a single bee. And she comes back and forth from the hive to the experimental area, by her own choice, because we're offering her sugar water and she really likes that. And you kind of, I guess, get to know this bee. But even the fact that we could do that and offer sugar water to a bee, and she was smart enough to remember the location that we were at, how to use the apparatuses, like land on the little platforms with sugar water, and just come back and forth over, hours and hours. Already for me, that was like, wow, these creatures are really, really smart. And then I suppose it was just a lot of reading other papers to see what they could do and see what had been done in the past and over the course of history, and just think, wow, I wonder how much further I can push that. What are their cognitive boundaries, or how much success could they have that's sort of similar to bigger brained animals like humans or mammals or birds?
What kind of reaction did you get from colleagues about doing this kind of research?
I work in a very supportive team, and so my colleagues that are closest to me are really supportive, and they actually work on these things as well. And I would then say some well-meaning but, further away colleagues who sort of maybe try to mentor me a little bit as a younger scientist were saying, we think maybe you should refocus on very ecologically relevant things because that's what's most important. There are problems there that need to be solved. And I suppose I had a different way of thinking, which was, while the experiments I was starting to do weren't necessarily relevant to the ecology of bees, it was relevant to other areas of science and also in our understanding of the evolution of intelligence and these sorts of things. And that's where I was sort of coming from. So that's why I ended up writing an opinion article, I suppose, just to make it clear I wasn't doing these experiments just flippantly. They are fun, so there is a fun aspect to them. But I was also doing them because I thought they really had value to other areas of science.
So you were essentially discouraged by some people earlier on in your career from doing these kind of experiments?
I would say nicely discouraged. It was definitely in a mentoring role of trying to refocus me maybe on the questions they thought were most important. But yeah, I suppose it was a little bit like, are you sure you want to be doing this stuff? We really think maybe you should refocus. And as I said, I do both kinds of research. So I still work on the ecologically relevant stuff, but I definitely won't stop doing the ecologically irrelevant experiments either.
I've always wanted to understand how you go about this, though, as a scientist. And let's take the example of bees, because this is obviously where you've spent most of your time. Can you tell me, how do you actually go about teaching bees how to do maths? Walk us through the steps. What's it like?
Basically, we work with Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, and we can have hives that are set out in different locations. That might be, in a paddock or a field or a reserve or something like that. And then what we do is we set up these sugar feeders where we put a low percentage of sugar water or sucrose solution. They will then go back to the hive and do this dance to tell other bees, hey, there's some sugar water. And so then they'll kind of self-recruit to these feeders we've got out. So we've just got a circular screen that we set up. There's little landing platforms that we can move around. And on these, we can also present what we call stimuli, so printed cards with maybe numbered elements on it in my case. So it might be 3 yellow triangles or 4 yellow triangles or something like that.
So you're not actually putting digits there. It's 3 things or 4 things.
It's 3 things or 4 things, a picture. Sometimes we have trained them to do symbolic stuff. So in some cases it has been symbols. But in this case, let's just take number discrimination. So we might be able to display 4 different cards. 2 of them might be 3 yellow triangles. 2 of them might be 2 yellow triangles. And then we want to train them to go to the larger number that they see. And what we do then is we have our little specialised bee spoon. We go and we pick these bees up from the feeders and we bring them over. We put them on one of the hanger little landing platforms, and that also has a high percentage of sucrose solution on it. They drink that. then hopefully this bee will do an orientation flight, so this little circular flight above the apparatus, and that means she's remembering where she is and she wants to come back there. She goes back to her hive, and then we're hoping within a few minutes she'll come back. And let's say it's great, she does come back, and then over the course of the next sort of 30 minutes maybe, depending on the apparatus type, we train her to be able to land well on the little platforms. And once she's really confident in landing on the platforms, then we can start the experiment and we can start showing her different pictures. And each time she goes back to the hive, we then take that chance to clean everything and move things around and randomize everything, put new cards up. So one time she comes, we might show her 3 versus 4. And then we might show her 1 versus 2, and then we might show her 5 versus 6 or something like that. And we might be training her, you get a little reward of sugar water if you land on the right one, but if you land on the incorrect one, you taste this like bitter substance. It's a bit like tonic water tasting to them. It doesn't harm them, and it's not enough to make them stop coming, but they just don't like it, especially when they're expecting sugar water. And then for the next maybe 1 to 8 hours, depending on how long your experiment is, you just work with this single bee and we put a little mark on her so we know which one she is.
So are some bees better at this than others?
There's definitely a lot of individual variation, and that is a really good thing. So you might have some bees that are really great at learning this, absolutely amazing, and then you have others that are less good, and maybe you have some that don't learn anything at all. And really for a hive, or bees in general, that's a good thing, because say you're really great at something, maybe it's finding blue flowers and foraging on those. And those are really rewarding flowers and they're great for the hive, but suddenly they disappear from the environment, climate change or a heat wave or something happens and those blue flowers are gone. And then suddenly going to the blue flowers and having learnt that really well to 100% accuracy isn't the great thing anymore. And if you're a little bit more flexible, so maybe you went to the blue flowers 70% of the time or 50% of the time, and you went to some other flowers the rest of the time, now you are helping the hive by being more flexible in what you can choose and what you do. So there's definitely benefits to the individual variation, but we do see some are better learners than others.
And how do you know that the bee is actually doing maths, or just seeking a reward? And how can we know the difference and be sure what's happening?
I mean, they're definitely always seeking the reward. That's what they want to do. But what we do is after we train them for, depending on the task complexity, it could be a few visits, it could be hundreds of visits to the apparatus. After that, we then sort of restart everything. We clean everything, we put new stuff on, and maybe we give them cards that look a little bit different or something like that. But we actually test what they've learnt, but instead of putting sugar water and this sort of bitter tasting substance called quinine, we now just put drops of water, and they can't tell the difference. But it means that we sort of get rid of any other cue they might have used. And then we just see which ones they try and land on, even though they're not getting any feedback for being correct or incorrect. But we do see what they think is correct and what's going to give them the sugar reward and what they're avoiding. And in that way, we can properly test them in the absence of any reward or aversion.
So what do you think you've learnt from teaching bees arithmetic?
In the sense of teaching them arithmetic, so we did the addition and subtraction, I learnt a lot about bees, but also about the applicability, I guess, through my reading of how other people have tested arithmetic in different animals. I work with a theoretical physicist called Andrew Greentree, and he is our mathematics guy. And he was the one who wanted to then have a look at all the bees we tested. He wanted to see, is there an aha moment? Like, at what point are they actually understanding what they need to do and doing it well? And so he had these grand plans of, yes, we're going to do these really complex analyses and we're going to find this aha moment. And he was really excited about it. And then instead, what we found with these very complex analyses that he ran was that each bee learned differently, and there was no singular aha moment, unfortunately for Andrew, and that bees actually were all learning in different ways and at different times. So that was really interesting to find that out about our little animals, that they were really just doing something different, and that's where that individual variation comes from.
It's its own aha moment in a way, isn't it?
They each have their own miniature aha moments, but there was not one population level one, and this is really what he wanted to find. But yeah, theoretical physicists and the actual reality of biology don't always go hand in hand.
Thinking about this a bit more broadly and going back to kind of your idea around ecological irrelevance. These studies can be quite fun, and they're fun to talk about and to watch, and people kind of remark on them when they see it. Did you see that video of the monkey doing arithmetic? But do they serve a greater purpose? And what do we learn from teaching a bee an odd or an even number?
There is a lot of value to these seemingly ecologically irrelevant experiments, and I think they're quite important to science overall. One thing is first to probably say, though, that just because we don't think they're ecologically relevant right at that moment, it doesn't mean that they won't become ecologically irrelevant, or we won't realise that they are actually ecologically relevant. So, for example, with my odd and even experiment on bees, maybe one day we'll find out that they choose flowers or remember flowers by looking at the petal number and remembering if it's an even number, that's a good flower. If it's an odd number, that's a bad flower, and, it doesn't have any reward or anything like that. That's also really relevant with environmental change impacts. So some behaviour or cognition experiment that we run might not have any relevance at that time, but maybe under changed environmental conditions, like, humans moving into a new environment or climatic change or, big habitat losses or something, that might actually make something more relevant. And it's hard to predict those sorts of things. Other reasons that we do these are for neuromorphic technology or bio-inspired technology. So this is, let's say computational systems, computers, or technology based on animals or other biological processes. That can be really useful to know how animals deal with uncertainty or how they learn. How they learn numbers might be something very interesting, because we as humans as well as animals, we do these computations very efficiently, and we do that just with, powered by food. People like to call it, we do it powered by a sandwich, and bees do it powered by a drop of nectar. And so that's a really efficient way to do it, especially if you consider like our big data centers and that sort of thing, how much energy they use to do computations. Even just a single computer uses a lot of energy in itself. So learning about those things from animals and how they do it very efficiently, that can help us in terms of developing new technology based on biological systems. And I think that's really interesting. And definitely there's been cases of these technologies being developed based on dragonflies or the vision of bees or all sorts of things like that. These sorts of experiments also help us understand how intelligence has evolved and whether it's evolved in similar ways in, animals that are really distant from us, like bees, compared to maybe, how it's evolved in primates and humans and, big mammals of dogs and cats. And so having these experiments that look like human experiments, I guess, look like something that's very human-centric, and testing it on something like bees can help us know, can they do the same things as us? And if they can, why? If they can't, why not? And again, how has intelligence evolved?
Does that mean that there is perhaps truly never an ecologically irrelevant experiment? We can't know.
That's one of the outstanding questions in my paper. I'm not sure if there is something that you could ever call completely ecologically irrelevant, and I am happy to be corrected on that if someone can give me an example. As I said before, even my experiments with bees, I'm giving them sugar water for their choices. They're living in these free-flying environments. So they would be considering this probably a foraging task with really weird-looking flowers.
Yeah. And, at the moment, there's a lot of pressure on research funding around the world in different places, perhaps more so in the US, say, than other places. But some people might look at this kind of research and say, well, shouldn't scientists be spending their time, curing cancer or trying to find solutions to climate change? And what's your response to kind of the resource element of this kind of research? Because I imagine people put that question to you too.
Yeah, I suppose that's also a really good point to consider when we're doing experiments like this. But I think just because something might not have relevance to ecology, it doesn't mean there's no relevance to science or society as a whole. So we can give animals a completely novel task that they've never seen before, and that might be something that's quite ecologically irrelevant, and then put them in a more natural environment and compare that to a less natural environment, or test it under different temperatures or something and see how their cognition changes. Are they still able to innovate? Are they still able to be flexible under different changed conditions? And this can help us understand how their cognitive development might change under different levels of environmental change.
So that's the way you would defend this type of research, by saying, well, there are these questions that we could be asking that could help solve future problems for humanity. Do you have to kind of bring it back to humanity in some way then?
Actually, for me, I don't think I always have to bring things back to humanity. Obviously, it's an easy sell with the bees to talk about understanding how their cognition changes because they need that for finding flowers. And that's very important for humans because they pollinate our flowers, which gives us food. So we want to know if they can't learn as well under changed environmental conditions, does that mean, there'll be less efficient pollinators, food production will go down, these sorts of things. But I do think that we don't always need to sell it in terms of what help can it provide for humans. I think sometimes just being able to understand the animal better and understand evolution better, that in itself is its own interesting question.
Okay, thank you so much, Scarlett, for coming on and talking about your work.
Thanks, Gemma. It's been great.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. It was written and produced by Katie Flood, and I'm Gemma Ware, the executive producer. Sound design was by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience to help you make better decisions. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. It really helps us reach a wider audience. Thanks so much for listening.